Welcome and thank you for joining us for episode 47. We are up to Genesis 47. We are, for whatever reason, throwing things off normal a little bit here. We've switched sides. I don't know if that does anything for anybody, but might as well. And so, do you have anything before we get started, Abe?
Yes, I have questions from people. So, back in episode 37, do you remember I said that there was a mistake in the episode?
Not really.
Okay.
37?
Well, I said, there's a mistake. Can anyone identify it? So people were texting me about that. So in the beginning of the episode, James called me by my full name, which is...
Your actual full name?
What did you call me?
Adrian Marie.
That's not actually my middle name. I don't know why he's always called me that. My middle name is Kimberly.
I feel like
that
Marie
was the
is
mistake.
every woman's middle name. Marie.
It's not.
But it's Kimberly, yeah.
Just a little trivia for you there. Secondly, someone asked why are we obsessed with The Little Mermaid? First of all, I'm not sure if I've said this before, but this is my home office. So I guess it's just one being.
It used to be my home office. Then it was both of our offices, and now it is no longer my office and only Adrian's office, and I have moved down into the basement of my
We
office.
have a wonderful finished basement.
Mm-hmm.
Brand new finish. That's the only thing down there.
Mm-hmm. It's nice, yeah.
In addition to...
It smells a little basement-y, but...
Many action figures. So I'm curious why I'm obsessed with The Little Mermaid. I only see 1, 2, 3 Little Mermaid things here. Where if we go into your office, there are hundreds of what you call action figures.
Which is my own private collection. I don't really want you guys veering into that. But no, maybe eventually we'll have a session downstairs with my action figures and
So anyway, I just love Disney. Ariel's not even my favorite princess, but apparently she's shown up in multiple videos, so.
Yeah. You've got a lot of Disney stuff and ardent Disney fan. So, yeah, that's part of the theme of the motif going on. This is not my...
I got all kinds of things in here, all kinds of trinkets.
If anyone thinks that is my Little Mermaid piggy bank, it is not.
A very good friend gave me that. We each have one. They're matching.
Yeah. Okay, so are we ready?
Uh-huh.
Genesis 47, make sure to read through your own copy at home. Here is my personal paraphrase for Genesis 47. We're kind of in the middle of an action, and this chapter is divided basically into two sections. It's Joseph's family meeting the Pharaoh, and then it's the logistics of Joseph's governance over the Egyptian economy. And it goes like this. Joseph brought 5 of his brothers to meet Pharaoh. Pharaoh asked what their occupation was, and they answered that they were shepherds. They asked to settle in Goshen, and Pharaoh gave them the best land that was there. Then Joseph brought Jacob in and introduced him to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh asked him how old he was, and Jacob said he's 130.
He's like, how old are you?
He rides in on his amigo, and Pharaoh asks him how old he is. Joseph's whole family was blessed with plenty of everything that they needed, well provided for, including the land in the district of Ramses in Goshen. Then, people throughout Egypt and Canaan had given most of their money to get the food that was in Egypt, but there were coming back and willing to give whatever else that they had so that they wouldn't starve because the famine continued. Joseph told them to bring back their livestock, which he accepted for a period of a year. And after that, Joseph sold them food in exchange for their land. Joseph ended up buying everyone's land except for the priests, we're told. And next, Joseph gave people seed for the land, and he asked for 1/5 of that yield to go to Pharaoh. The other 4/5 the people were allowed to keep for food for their own family, and the people were very pleased, we're told. So if you're wondering if that was a harsh business transaction, we're told the people were very pleased with Joseph's business practices and actually said to him, "You've saved our lives." The Israelites, Jacob's family, became numerous in Goshen. Jacob lived in Egypt for 17 years and then died at 147. When Jacob's death was near, he called in Joseph and made a covenant with him, symbolized by putting, this happens often in Genesis, covenant symbolized by putting your hand underneath the other person's thigh. Jacob asked to not be buried in Egypt, but to be buried in Canaan with his fathers. And Joseph swore that he would honor his father's wishes. And Jacob leaned on his staff and worshipped God. which I think is kind of a cool phrase. And that ends out my summary for Genesis 47.
He leaned on his staff,
Yeah. So he's
like falling on your sword.
No, like leaning on he couldn't stand up right by himself. But
Oh.
worship is so important. Like so he's
I
worshiping
see.
God in the midst of his weakness.
Yes.
And I think that's like to his dying day at 147. It means he's
Yes.
standing and worshiping God despite his weakness.
Yeah. I also really liked when I don't know what your translation says, but when Pharaoh asks him how old he is, he says, I have traveled this earth for 130 hard years, but my life has been short compared to the lives of my ancestors. And I feel like that goes back to what we were talking about, how after the flood, God shortened the lives of people. And I think I said, like, I think that's him being merciful.
Yeah.
Like, he knew or knows that, like, clearly when people are living 1,000 years, they have difficulty remaining faithful to me. Not only that, but like Jacob is describing these as like hard years.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't say his life is any harder than I mean, yes, his wife died.
One of them, yes.
Right, exactly. Good point.
His favorite
One of
one,
them,
though, in his defense.
His son died, but was reunited to him. Like, in some ways, he's much better off than many people that I know today. So it's not like his life is any harder than anyone else's, but he describes it as those being 130 hard years.
Yeah.
What does your translation say in verse 9?
Yeah, very similar. Jacob said to Pharaoh, the years of my pilgrimage are 130. My years have been few and difficult. Few. Yeah, again, that's clearly a relative term at 130
years.
So
this is someone who has his family at his bosom. I don't know why I said it like that. Has his family around him at all times. He has always been prosperous. I'm not saying he didn't have to work, but you know, like his earthly material needs have always been met.
Yeah. So it's
not really that hard. I think it just speaks to like the human condition. Like every year on this earth is hard.
Right. I think that's a good point. Is number one, your point about God being merciful by shortening the human life is actually, you know, the idea that today people are doing everything we can to perpetuate as long of lives as possible, and like if you're a believer, like why? Not that you have a death wish, because if you're on earth, you have a mission, but. I am but a stranger here, heaven is my home.
Yes.
Like that's the posture of a Christian. And so he had some family hardship. His brother was, you know, his dad didn't love him the way he loved his brother. He was running for his life from his brother. His uncle Laban deceived him in pretty, you know, meaningful ways and changed his salary a bunch of times. So, but your point that but everybody's got stuff.
Exactly.
Is also true. And so like I think anybody, if you've spent 130 years on life, you wouldn't say my years have been few, but I guarantee you'd say they've been difficult at times. You know, so
a long hard road.
That is life on earth. It's a good summary.
So when he says like he makes Joseph promise to bury him back in Canaan, because I know that that's like the land of his people, that God gave them that land. I'm really interested in, so I would like to be buried with my ancestors. What?
You done an Ancestry.com survey recently?
No, I mean like my immediate family.
Oh, yeah.
Like actually buried where they are buried.
Yeah.
But I feel like there's been such a trend in people... And I'm not saying one is right or wrong, but why do you think there's been such a trend of people kind of going away from that and being cremated?
Yeah.
And maybe not buried? Like, is that just so my grandma and grandpa have had burial plots they bought. My parents also are going to be buried there. My grandma was embalmed and buried, but my grandpa, like 16 years later, was cremated and buried. But why do you think there's such a trend away from this?
Yeah. It was, so not that long ago, it was fairly taboo in the Christian culture of America to be cremated. Somewhere along the lines it slipped in the idea that cremation was some way of like thumbing your nose at God and saying like, go ahead and try to put these pieces back together on the resurrection. Like at least people interpret it that way. That's what I've got, the impression that I've gotten from a couple generations older than me. So to such an extent that it's so taboo that I think a lot of Christians ended up having like full burials, in part even though cremation is more economical, they had them in part because they were afraid of like what some others might say. Well, today there's almost no stigma attached to cremation. It is more economical. Anybody who trusts what Jesus can do in the resurrection understands that whether we are ashes due through cremation or ashes or dust due to natural erosion processes, knows God can assemble us no matter what, and it's going to be miraculous no matter what. So I think there might have been some kind of pagan stigma attached to it for a long time that just doesn't exist really anymore.
I think maybe people also don't value their land as much. Like, it doesn't have as much significance. Like, back, in different times, it was like, this is my family's land. Or maybe, like, Dwight Schrute, like, we're all buried here.
Plus, there isn't the cremation process.
Oh, yeah, it's newer.
It doesn't exist. You have to get the fire temperatures, I forget what it is, but to such a level that it can actually, like, it's hard to do in the ancient world. So there's probably a bunch of different reasons for it, but people were concerned about, you're right, land and legacy and our people. We also don't think of that nearly as much as an individualistic society as opposed to the ancient Near East, which was collectivistic, and I identify who I am based on which people group I am connected to. It's neither inherently right nor wrong, but modern people don't think that way quite as much. So burial and where I'm buried is not considered as big of a deal.
Yeah.
All right, so here's 3 devotional thoughts for the day. Number 1, proper preparation. We've stated numerous times throughout this whole Joseph narrative that God is the one who is sovereignly in control the entire time. And yet, the fact that God is in control doesn't mean that Joseph is off the hook when it comes to wise, careful, faithful planning. And that comes in the first part of the chapter. It comes when Joseph coaches his brothers. And he says, look, you're going to enter into the presence of somebody who's very powerful with this Pharaoh. So I want you to be respectful, and I want you to not come across as a threat. And therefore, he only sends in, you notice he doesn't send in all of them. He only sends in 5 of them.
I didn't notice that.
He doesn't want to make this look like this is an invading tribe that is entering, which is what, by the way, the Egyptians are going to perceive the Israelites as long term. But he doesn't want to give that impression now. And so he very strategically only has some of them come in. And he says, yeah, tell them that you are shepherds, because the Egyptians really kind of loathe such people, and they're not going to want you to be in their presence. They're going to give you a nice plot of land way over there in Goshen. And so it's very careful and calculated, and it's like, whereas we've seen, like Jacob in his youth, for instance, was kind of conniving at times. The flip side, the more positive side of conniving is methodical, careful, faithful, prudent planning.
Yeah.
So
it's interesting too that Pharaoh says, oh, if any of them are actually good at their jobs, they can actually come work for me.
Yeah.
Like, he doesn't like shepherds unless they can maybe do something for him.
The guy knows that the hand of the Lord is upon Joseph, and he is ready. It's kind of like a positive, like, if you're a friend of so-and-so's, you're a friend of mine, because if your group of people has this special magic power by which we can interpret the signs from God and like bring prosperity in the land, I want as many of you working for me as possible. So Pharaoh is very generous to them, and I think Joseph's planning here is an important part. He trusts that God is sovereign, but he also carefully plans. And I think the general application then is work hard and trust God.
Yeah.
Like, those are both Christian principles.
So in the Old Testament, I hope this isn't a dumb question. In the Old Testament, did even the Israelites who knew or I guess I should say the descendants of Abraham at this point, that knew who the one true God was, did they think that God was only for them, and therefore, so what you don't see or haven't seen is like any, I guess maybe the right word isn't gospel, but any like gospel proclamation.
Yeah, like if, evangelism.
Yeah, like if Pharaoh was seeing that, okay, this God has blessed these people, like why isn't he asking Joseph like, or like, tell me more about this God, or Joseph offering like, yeah, we are really blessed, this is why, like we know who the one true God is. Did they just think like they have their own gods and this is our God?
Yeah, to some extent, yes. We are going to see a couple, it's called proselytizing in the Old Testament, when people who convert to the Jewish faith. We are going to see some people who are examples of that. The whole narrative of Naaman is a fascinating story about that kind of conversion. But remember, in Egypt, the Pharaoh himself is a god.
Oh.
And so he is so firmly rooted and entrenched in this that essentially to become a follower of the God of Israel would mean, to some extent, forfeiting his position. And we get no indication that he wants to do that. So it's, although we're not told that, Joseph or Jacob or the others don't testify to the goodness of their God, it doesn't seem like there's many.
Well, I guess like when
converts.
Daniel goes to Babylon, he
Same thing, yeah.
is talking about God.
Yep, same thing. Like, our God is the one true God, and I'm not going to serve your gods, even in my dietary habits. So, yeah. So we do see that. It's not so that sometimes the way it's been summarized is that in the Old Testament there is a come strategy of evangelism. Come and see the God who is the one true God. And in the New Testament, it's a Great Commission, a go strategy. Go out into the world and be my witnesses to the ends of the earth. So in the Old Testament, it's come to God, come to his temple, come to his people, come to his tribe, In the New Testament, it's people dispersing out, which is kind of overly simplistic. But we do see converts in the Old Testament. So the second devotional thought here is Joseph's business sense. Again, he understands that God is the God who is ultimately in control. He's sovereign over all things. The weather patterns, the produce and production of the fields, all that kind of stuff. What he's still doing is he's still planning. So Joseph has a strategy. And so what he's going to do in all this is he is going to start selling food for the sake of cattle. So they stored up all this food for 7 years. When the famine starts to come, okay, we will give you food, but we want your cattle. He does that for a year. After that, then he says, yeah, we will give you food. You still need food, but we want some of your land. And what we're going to do is we're going to give you the seed. So we will take care of all of the overhead for this, but we need you to work your fields. And what we want in return is 20%, a fifth of what is produced from your land. We'll take the other 4/5 you can take for yourself. And you can, since we're one of the only nations producing crops at this point, you can get a probably good return from other people around the world for this if in trading. And so the Egyptians are prospering, and Pharaoh is now, because he has all this land and all this cattle and a continuous source for the definite future of you're going to continue to reap 20% of whatever is harvested. It sets him up just tremendously, tremendously well. And it's, again, a good example of Joseph doing careful, good business sense. And therefore, again, I think the application is plan for the future, understand God is in control. So the Bible also says, mankind determines or plans his, he lays out his plans for the future, but the Lord determines his footsteps. And part of that, what that means is don't think that you're in control, total control of the future. That doesn't let you off the hook of planning for the future, though. Be responsible, plan for the future, trust that God ultimately is in control.
Yeah.
You're smiling like I said something.
No, I was thinking
really
of
weird.
that thing people say, if you want to hear God laugh, tell him your plans.
Oh.
I think I used to think that was in the Bible.
People do say things like that. Funny little, they're
I like
funny
funny little
mantras
things,
and
especially
phrases.
if they rhyme.
You do like those. I don't like those as
Yeah.
much, comparatively. So, devotional thought number 3. Jacob's still prioritizing the Lord. And what I mean by that is, so again, Jacob, who's again really old at this time, he's foreign in this land, but he also knows where his ultimate home is. And so he's got these very specific requests about how, okay, when I eventually die, I don't want you to bury me here. God had promised to me that I'm going to inherit, and our nation, our people are going to inherit the land of Canaan. And therefore, when I die, I want you to take me back there and bury me with, the rest of the forefathers and family there. And so sure enough, after 147 years, he dies. And Jacob, despite all his flaws along the way, after 147 years, his priorities are still straight. And we're told that when Joseph agrees to this plan, Jacob is he's standing up to rest on his staff and he's worshiping God. And again, I think that's just such a cool image for somebody who literally physically can't stand anymore, and yet they'll do whatever it takes and use whatever assistance they can get to worship, to stand up and worship God. And I think, the application is know where your home is and worship leaning on your staff, knowing how dependent you are on your Lord. Any other thoughts on Genesis 47?
No.
Okay. I think that's it for the lesson then. Why don't we close with prayer?
Sure.
Heavenly Father, we strike this balance in our lives of knowing that you are sovereign and in control every step of the way. Even though we don't understand how you're working in the details, the narrative of Joseph has proven time and time again that you work through things that we would never see, we can't see, and we can't understand, but every single detail of our lives is ultimately submitting and bending a knee to your powerful control. And yet, that doesn't just mean that we're fatalistic. We still have responsibilities. We still want to prove ourselves faithful. And therefore, we also understand that we want to be wise managers of all the opportunities that you give to us. Lord, we know we're not perfect at this. We know that your Son Jesus has forgiven us for our failures to manage our blessings wisely. But in that forgiveness and in that grace, give us a new spirit that desires to manage things to your glory and in a way that serves and loves other people ahead of ourselves. Again, may we do this to your glory. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Thanks a lot for studying with us. We'll see you tomorrow for Genesis 48.